Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think we're ready to start now. Sorry for the delay. The last panel ran over a little bit, but we have a good panel for you today. Welcome to the discussion on effective advocacy. My name is Umar Ahmed. I'm the attorney advisor with OTA. I'd like to start by opening up a question to you all. How many of you actually know who your council member is? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, good, a good amount. And how many of you have actually met your council member? Okay, still a good amount. Now, our panelists here today will be discussing how to advocate. We're fortunate to have with us some key members of the non-profit community with us today to shed light on this issue. We have Tori Beckett Bore from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We have Sean Hillendorf from Councilmember Robert White's office. We have Sherry Kimmel from office. We have Amir Mansour from Councilmember, Randy Marshall from Chairman Phil Mendelson's office. We'll have a session. So the layout for this panel is more informal than the others. We're hoping it's going to be a discussion between the panelists, an informal discussion. There will be a set time for Q&A at the end, so if you do have any, that you please hold them to the end. Due to limited time, we're going to give a shorter number of time to each panelist. But without further ado, I would like to start by welcoming Sean, who will be talking to us about the legislative process. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you for being here. Good afternoon. Again, I'm Sean Hillendorf, Legislative Director for At-Large. My purpose here today is to give you the tools to empower you to change our policies. And the way that you're going to be empowered is by knowing what we're doing and being informed about why we're doing it. So we basically have three major tools at the council. The first one that I'm going to walk you through is legislation. Legislation is the one that kind of gets usually the most spotlight in our work. But it's not always our first place to turn when we identify a problem. The second one is budget. Around budget time, you hear a lot from your council members about what they're asking for and what they received, and where we're spending the roughly $14 billion that we have. The third tool that we have is our oversight. And this is where you may watch on television, if there's nothing better on, your council members calling agency directors to task. One good example is the chairman's vigorous oversight of DCRA through spotlight on the circumstances of our constituents. We try to push them to do a better job to meet their mission under the existing law. The legislative process, and to just give you a sense of how a permanent bill, that's a normal law as you would think of it, moves through the process. Legislation usually starts for us by somebody identifying a problem. In its best form, a law is a solution to a problem that a constituent has, whether it's your rent is going up higher than you can afford to pay, your rental unit has poor conditions that aren't being resolved. It starts with a problem. Once you have the problem, then you have to think through what's the best. We already have the law to address this, it's just not being implemented, then it might be an oversight question. Do we have the law and does the agency want to implement it, but they just don't have the resources, maybe they don't have the inspection staff, maybe they don't have something else. Then it's really a budget question. For us, legislation is usually the last answer to a problem when everything else fails. Because going through the legislative process can be slow, it can be cumbersome, and it takes a lot of energy and effort and advocacy to get it through. But that's what many of us up here spend our days doing, because at the end of the day, there's a lot that needs to be done. When legislation starts, usually council members will reach out to stakeholders and people who identify the problem for them, and come up with some kind of initial draft piece of legislation. Any council member can introduce legislation before the council. The mayor and the attorney general typically request that the chairman introduces legislation on their behalf. And so that really is kind of the basket of laws that we get. Different council members have a different amount of kind of outreach and conversations before an introduction of a bill. But once a bill is introduced, the chairman will then typically refer a permanent bill to one of our committees. Each committee typically has 5 members and has a jurisdiction over a topic area, so housing and neighborhood revitalization or transportation and the environment. When the committee receives the bill, the next step there is for them to schedule a hearing. And this is where the formal part of the process, where your voices are recorded and made part of the record. So you can come down to the council at a hearing. They're usually at the Wilson building, though they don't have to be. And folks will get 3 to 5 minutes to tell their council members their opinion on whatever topic is before us. To the extent that the hearing outcome is that it seems like there's something that we should move forward on, the committee will move to what we call a markup, which is essentially a vote at the committee level. On some version of that bill is introduced that we've now vote to mark it up. They'll pass the so that going forward we have the benefit of your perspective. Once the committee has passed the bill, if they do so, it gets agendized for the full council to review. Will be agendized for the full council to review. The council to pass a permanent piece of legislation has 2 votes, separated by 2 weeks. For a normal bill, the majority of the council has to pass it at 2 different second reading. That bill has passed the council. It'll go to the mayor for her review. And then unfortunately, because the district doesn't have the autonomy that we want, it has to go before Congress. Not our first step in trying to solve the problem. So I'm going to talk to you just very briefly about the 2 other kind of ways that we do solve problems. Every spring, the council goes through a series of oversight hearings, every agency for the council, and then budget hearings to set the budget for the next year. also still exercises authority in this area, though we've taken some steps to try to address that. But Congress still puts riders on our budget in ways that I think everyone on the council agrees are bad decisions on the part of Congress that take away from our local autonomy and the power of our democracy and our votes here. They've done it on all kinds of things, from abortion to marijuana, to really hot button issues where Congress says, no, the District of Columbia, its representatives and its residents don't get to decide these things. Us, from wherever else in the country we're from, we're the ones who are going to decide those issues for you. And so they put riders on our budget telling us how we can spend our locally raised tax dollars. That's a challenge that I think everyone is going to be trying to overcome for the coming years. But that's really what I wanted to do, is just provide you kind of a highlight of those three tools that we have and how we work through that process. And then I'll let Amir get into some of the details about some of the other processes.
Go ahead. Great. Thank you all for coming today. I want to thank OTA for hosting us and for Umar for moderating this panel. My name is Amir Mansour. I'm a legislative counsel for Ward 1 Council Member Brianne Nadeau. And thank you, Sean, for really providing that thorough explanation of the legislative oversight and budget process. Thanks to your heavy lifting, I get to answer some of the simpler stuff. So first, I've been asked to speak on gauging timing when you're proposing a policy, and specifically as it relates to emergency measures. One thing that I think is important to keep in mind, broadly speaking, is to allot the time necessary to engage with stakeholders and advocates to come up with the best policy proposal. One way this is done is by forming working groups. And it's really important to consider who you invite to your working group. Inviting as many voices as possible is very helpful in creating a well-rounded law or a well-rounded policy proposal, but at the same time it can slow down the process as well. So you want to find the right balance when you're considering who will be a part of your working group. And depending on the complexity and the complexity of the subject matter of the policy that you're proposing, there can be a range anywhere from a few weeks to months, if not years, as to how long it takes to get a policy figured out. Randy, you can speak to that a little bit as well. Also, it's important to allot some time for the legislative staffers to draft the proposed legislation as well. I would say at the least, and this is bare minimum, you want to give at least 2 weeks, if not longer, for that to happen. Some of the things that go into that process, beyond just writing the law, drafting the policy, is providing some time for the general counsel to review our introduced legislation, and some time for the budget office to do what's called a fiscal impact study that will determine how much the specific bill will cost. So now I'm specifically going to talk a little bit about emergency legislations, which is a mechanism whereby the council may enact legislation quickly on a short-term basis. This is something that's really reserved for things that truly are emergencies. It's not something that council likes to do very often, and it's really to address needs of the district that are an impending challenge. So first, the district's charter allows the council to enact special emergency legislation without the need for a second reading and without the need for congressional review. There is still a mayoral review, and also by the rule of the council, an emergency legislation is not assigned to a committee and does not go through the normal COW process, the committee on the whole process. Usually that takes a few weeks between introduction and when it's enacted, but sometimes it can be even quicker. Emergency legislation can be in effect for no longer than 90 days, so it really is a temporary measure. Secondly, I want to identify, or I want to speak about how advocates, our offices, identify shortfalls in the law. Our office identifies shortfalls in the law in many different ways, but what is most common is when we hear a groundswell of citizens reaching out to our offices, taking meetings with our council member, or calling our offices to talk about a specific issue or a specific law that is rather something that works or doesn't work, and we think there are strategies that we can come up with to address it. Sometimes the shortfalls are identified by advocates from their work with citizens, and they convey that message onto us. This allows us to get into the legislative process and the legislative drafting process a little bit quicker. I think the most effective thing in identifying shortfalls is to keep your ear to the streets. Staying connected to tenants and people who rely on housing with assistance from the city really gives you a sense of what is necessary and what laws are and aren't working. Nothing really replaces community engagement at that level. So that's all I have today. I'm going to pass it on to my co-panelists.
So, Sean and Amr, thank you for that. Now that we understand the legislative process, I'd like to... Sean?
I just wanted to mention, I don't think I mentioned before, I brought in the back of the room, if you haven't got them already, we have some brochures on how to testify at the council and on how a bill becomes a law. So if I was droning on a little bit, we have several documents in the back that can tell you all that in writing.
Yeah, they're really good. I suggest you pick them up on the way out. So thanks so much for that overview. I think now that we understand the legislative process a bit better, I would like to ask a question to Tori to give her insight into how we can most effectively tell our story to the council.
Great, thanks so much. So my name is Tori. I'm with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And so basically we're a national group and we advocate for the lowest income folks. We believe that everyone deserves access to safe, decent, affordable, and accessible housing, and we ensure that there's socially just policies put in place to do just that. So I have much experience doing advocacy at the state and federal level, so I'm just going to give you guys some pointers about how to have some effective, productive advocacy meetings. And it looks like a lot of folks here already have a lot of that great experiences, which is wonderful. So hopefully this will just be some added things to think about the next time you have your lobby meeting with a policy member. So first, I think what's really key to keep in mind is that a lobby visit is just a conversation. So it happens in the halls of power, which can be really daunting and intimidating, but it's really just face-to-face conversation with people like you and me. And very often you will be the expert and know more about the particular policies that you're talking about, depending on where, if it's a new policy that you want introduced, you'll be the experts about that issue. Secondly, no lobby meeting is the final conversation that you'll be having with any given individual. It's really just an opportunity to create dialogue and a relationship with the staff person or policymaker that you're meeting with. So a great way to become versed on some of these policy issues is to connect with organizations that are experts in these various areas. So for DC policy information on housing and community development, CNHED are great. They have a lot of wonderful resources and fact sheets that you can bring with you to your meetings. And CNHED stands for the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development. And they also have an advocacy arm where you can go and take part in that as well. And my agency, NLIHC, we offer fact sheets on federal housing policies such as the housing and housing benefit cuts and other federal legislation, but we also have an advocacy guide where we do a breakdown of all the different federal programs and also state programs available. We give 2 to 3 pages for each topic area, and then we have a whole section on how to conduct effective advocacy. So that's a really great tool, and you can get that for free on our website, which is nlihc.org. And then we also have there's so many different national housing organizations here in DC that provide a lot of information about general housing issues and then some policy issues as well. So the National Housing Trust, National Fair Housing Alliance, the National Alliance of HUD Tenants, the National Law Center on Homelessness and Housing Poverty, the Coalition on Human Needs. Those are just a few of the organizations that are out there and available for you to get more information from. So you can also find out, especially if there's a bill that's introduced already that you want to read more about and figure out how you feel about it, you can always find the source material from websites. So for federal legislation, it would be on house.gov or senate.gov. For DC, it would be DC Council information. It would be dccouncil.us. And so that's a great resource to find the actual source legislation. And again, there's organizations that provide the data to back up your advocacy when you go into a meeting. So once you have the resources and you feel you've read a lot about or enough about the different issues that you want to advocate for, it's not expected that you know literally everything about the policy you're advocating for. It's okay to bring those materials with you to these meetings. And also it's great to provide those materials to the staff people and the policymakers as well, so they can refer back to that at a later date and remember your discussion. So how do we go about telling our story effectively, and what's a great way to conduct one of these meetings? So really it's great to start out kind of summarizing the policy that you're speaking about in a few sentences, and then always to connect it to broader data and to your personal story as well. So like I was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of data out there. We at NLIHC provide data on the number of affordable housing that's affordable for renters at the lowest income levels, and we provide data on what the housing wage is, so what one needs to make in order to afford an apartment at fair market rent. In DC, you have to make $34 an hour in order to afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. So those are kind of the data that you can bring with you into those meetings, and then you can talk about your story. And so some of the things that are good to keep in mind is talking about describing your home. Where do you live? What does it look like? And then telling a story about the home that you're proud of and what you've accomplished with the resources that you're given, or what you could accomplish if you were given access to resources. And then describe your hopes for the future and what you want to accomplish. So an example of this is, let's say I'm just giving a random example. Let's say you want to talk about the Housing Trust Fund. I worked in Pennsylvania for a while in the State Housing Trust Fund, and we would have meetings with folks that would give their personal stories. So one of this would be, we want to get a permanent revenue source for the Housing Trust Fund. There's a lack of affordable homes in Pennsylvania, let's say, and we want to ensure that we have more access to affordable homes. And I was given help by the Greatest Housing Organization, and they gave me all these resources which helped me get into a permanent home. Before that, I was living on the street. I was homeless, just trying to figure out day to day where to live. But this organization, XYZ organization, gave me assistance, and now I have a permanent home. I've been living there for 4 years, and now I'll be able to go to school. I'm trying to save money and set money aside to go to school. So that's kind of an example of what you can give as a story, how to frame your story around, what these resources could do for you, or how impactful they are and meaningful for you. It's really great to connect a face to data and to the policies, and to show folks that, there's real people behind the money and the resources that are out there. Lastly, kind of how do you identify counter arguments to your perspective so you can effectively address them as they come up in a meeting? First, do your homework. Research your policymakers' pages. They have pages, their own websites, things like that. And keep in mind that your policymaker makes their decisions about how they're going to vote based on a few different factors. So one of that is through their political party. Another one is, they may vote based on party lines. So if they're a Democrat and the Democratic Party has decided they support a bill, they could go along and support that bill as well. They could also consider what their constituents value when voting. So their constituents are their voters, so they want to make sure they represent them as well. And they may also consider their personal values. For example, their religious beliefs on caring for the poor. They also could consider political, financial feasibility of the vote. So you may often hear that your representative would love to support more homeless programs, but there isn't money for it. So long-term members of the legislature or city council or any other political body may avoid introducing bills or voting on bills that have any new spending. So it's important to consider what it is you're asking your policymaker to make a vote on. And if you're asking for a very expensive request, it may take more than one session to get that request through. When we were advocating for the Housing Trust Fund, we spent 8 years total advocating for the Housing Trust Fund in Pennsylvania. It took us just a couple years to get it into place, and then we spent years trying to get a permanent revenue source for it. But now we finally accomplished that, and we're trying to get more money for that. So you have to have some patience, and it can take a while, but it's also very exciting to see that happen. So some kind of questions you could get that could be a little bit of an issue to address, or could be hard to address sometimes, could be, so my policymaker is very conservative, and I know they often vote conservatively on these issues, or my policymaker is very liberal and they always support these issues. I know they're going to support these issues. What's the point? Why should I reach out and speak to them? So basically what we say is you can always move a policymaker in one direction or the other. So if your policymaker is a staunch opponent, they're really outwardly opposed and they speak all the time against housing policies and how much they hate them, let's say, or they don't agree with them or whatever. You can, the more you interface with them and interact with them and inform them of the data and give them your personal perspective, the more likely you can move them from a staunch opposer to just an opposer, someone who's not actively out against the legislation. And let's say someone is a supporter of housing bills, but they aren't out there actively speaking for them. By interfacing with them and talking to them, you can get them moving from, a supporter to maybe a staunch supporter, maybe championing legislation and introducing that. So that's always something pretty important to keep in mind. And I think that that kind of wraps up and also remember, it's always okay to say you don't know something and that you'll get back to the person and follow up with them with more details. So you're not expected to know every single detail about legislation. So it is okay to say, I'm not sure, let me get back to you about that.
Thank you, Tori. That was very useful. My next question is for Randy and Sherry. I would like to ask, how can we work collaboratively with council staffers and the council to make our voices heard?
I'll go ahead and start. So I'm a council staffer. I work for Chairman Mendelson's office. I have people coming in from the public all the time, whether it's a constituent issue, such as housing code enforcement issue. Maybe their stove isn't working, or maybe the heat's not working. They reach out to our office, and we will connect them maybe with someone in our constituent services office. They'll reach out to maybe an agency to have them go out, DCRA, to go out to the property to try to figure out what's going on. As far as policy-wise, one of the things that we take into consideration, so when you come in to talk about a housing code issue, that helps us build the case for potentially for policies. So you might think you're coming in just to talk about your stove not working, or maybe your landlord isn't being responsive. But if we feel like it's happening enough time, it raises those particular issues to the level of a public policy. And we feel at that point maybe the council needs to try to insert themselves. So, for instance, one of the things that that it's important for folks to realize there's no inconsequential interaction with a council staffer. So even though you may not be speaking with a council member, the council staffers are constantly interacting with the council members, and we get to tell them about our interactions with folks from the public. We get to tell them about so when we might be having an increase in phone calls about heating issues at a particular apartment building, that will prompt my council member or another council member that you get in contact with to respond and to react and to try to do something about it, either potential avenues through an executive agency like DHCD, like the housing authority, or even DCRA.
I'm Sherry Kimball, and I'm a constituent services director, so I deal less specifically with tenant issues because I deal with a lot of issues. So a lot of what I'll say has to do with a lot of different things like that. One of the things we were asked to talk about is how to build a collective voice and find similarly situated stakeholders. Of course, social media has changed that. You can reach people through Facebook and email and Twitter and listservs, but don't think that's the only way. It's still very important to reach out to your church groups, your neighborhood associations. This is a really good way to find things. We also think, I also think it's a good idea to talk to your council member, because if you call and you have an issue and then all of a sudden we're seeing there's other people having the same issues, or I talk to other constituent services people, such as Kelly, who's sitting right here, for Councilmember McDuffie, we find out all of a sudden this is more of a problem than we think it is, and that's a good way to get your points across. And as was said earlier, sometimes there's a way to solve the problem without going through legislative process. And if we can, that's a great way to do it. You also find out when you do come in and talk, if you come in and talk as a group, look at your group and see what their your members' strong points are. Maybe some can write real well, or some can speak, or some. If you go to a certain council member's office and you have somebody there from that council member's office, that might elevate you a little bit more. So have that person talk. Ward 5, or Ward 2 person, and then this will get the attention more quickly. And don't think that you have to talk to the council member, as was stated earlier, because the staff is in there and kind of in the trenches working on things, and we make sure that the council member knows what we're hearing, and it's important to them. And don't ever think you're wasting anybody's time coming into the council offices. The council member wants to hear from you. They want to hear from their constituents. They want to know the problems, and that's the way we hear them. In our office, and I'm sure it's in a lot of other offices, the ANC is really important. If you get your ANC behind something, that we give our ANC a lot of great weight. If they say, this is important to us, then we're going to think it's important also. When you come with a problem, it's also important to be knowledgeable and specific. Know what you want for a final outcome, and look at things. Sometimes something you think is bad may not be bad. Something you think is good may not be quite as good. I'll give this as an example, and this may not be a great one, but TOPA rights, when they did that bill and took away, the TOPA on single-family homes, we were hearing from people who were saying they wouldn't rent their basements or their carriage houses out anymore. They were turning them into Airbnbs, and that was losing a lot of really good stock for renters, because there were a couple people, not the vast majority, who just were causing all kinds of problems. Now that has gone, people are back to renting long-term again and not using it for short-term. So really, in a way, even though it sounded like that might have been bad, it might have been better for renters. If you have something, it's also good to go to the chair and the members of the committee first. Most council members have a committee. If it's something, housing, then, you're going to want to go to the housing committee and the people who are on that. My council member is finance and revenue. He sits on a lot of the committees, but he won't be the one to take it, through. We have a lot of things that go to the chairman's office, as Randy well knows. And you can get all that information by calling your council member's office. There's also sheets in the front of the office, right when you come in the front door of the Wilson building, that have everything. It's also available online on the council website. And it's also good to know your council member's history, and that you can kind of build your case based on what has been important to them in the past. And so, that doesn't hurt either. Do a little homework. But you'll always have somebody to listen to you. What else did I want to say here? You can stop by in the office in groups. It doesn't have to be a huge group. It can be small. It can be, just get your point across, come in and talk. One thing that our office doesn't particularly like is a lot of phone calls. Sometimes we get people switch to us and they're saying, yes, I want you to support that bill. And we're like, what bill? The one they told me to tell you to support. That does us no good at all. We need to know what the bill is. Call us. That's great. We want to talk to you, but we don't want a bunch of robocalls. Just like you don't really like them at home. It's kind of like spam or something. It's also good to make sure that the people who want something are in the district. We want to know that it's our constituents that want this, not people who live someplace else. So come to public meetings. Get to know the council members. They're out there. They all go to meetings. They all go out there. They want to be talked to. I know I go to a bunch of meetings. I know we all go to a bunch of meetings every month. So come and talk to us. Get to know your council member. That's what we're here for. And I think that's a good stopping point for me.
Thank you, Sherry. Well, for all of you who've been here very patiently, our volunteer is handing out a raffle ticket for our raffle prize today, which is a white marble food tray. So if you see the volunteer going around, you can get a ticket from him. In the meantime, I would like to ask the panelists, do you all have any live examples of any legislation that you've worked on that would be a particularly useful case study for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Sean mentioned is the budget process. I mean, that's one of the biggest pieces of legislation that the council does every single year. And this is the one opportunity that the public can come down and talk about what are their priorities as far as resources go. Where should we be putting the $14 billion that the district has access to? And this is, there are things like the HPTF fund. It's a Housing Production Trust Fund. This is where right now about $100 million is put into that account every year. It's supposed to be spent to different housing, affordable housing buildings, to either preserve housing or to build new housing. And as we all know, DC is in a housing crisis, and so it's important for people to come down and to let us know where you would like that money to go, especially when it comes to affordable housing. How much, this is a decision for housing vouchers. How much we put towards housing vouchers. We definitely don't put enough money towards housing vouchers. And so when you come down and you talk about the importance it is in order to make sure that folks who need access to affordable housing, that they can get a voucher, that there's enough to go around, that you're coming down to the Wilson building, which is a public building, anyone can come in and talk to your council member and let them know how important this is.
Sure. So, Randy spoke a little bit about how the budget process results in changes every year based on input. And as you mentioned, every year the council puts more money into vouchers, into some of our affordable housing programs, though it's unfortunately never enough. An example I have is from oversight. As mentioned earlier, that we've had a number of oversight hearings with DCRA. And my boss has been to them time and time again asking questions about why is it that so many of our residents come and talk to our constituent services folks, come and talk to the council member, come and talk to our staff about the conditions of their rental housing. So, we have an agency that's set up to fix that. Why do we have so many people who come down and they say that, they call their landlord again and again and again. They call the agency for an inspection over and over and over again. They'll get inspection after inspection after inspection, and yet the water leak is still leaking, right? There's still mold on their ceiling. The chairman has done a great job on highlighting these issues through oversight, and the result of that, because we hear the same thing from so many people and so many times over, has been a large number of bills from our office and from most offices on the council trying to get a framework in place so that tenants are empowered. The one that I'll mention that came out of this is the one that my boss introduced, Councilmember Robert White introduced, the Housing Rehabilitation Incentives Regulation Amendment Act. What this legislation would do is essentially tell our housing providers, hey, listen, if you have this housing condition that's been identified and you don't abate it, if you don't fix it after 6 months, which is a long period of time to fix a housing code violation, we're gonna fine you again. We're gonna fine you at a higher level for more money than you were before. And then we're going to take that money that we're getting from these higher fines through this bill, and we're going to break that money up. We're going to give some of that money back to these impacted tenants, because tenants deserve compensation when they live in the horrible conditions that some of our tenants do. We're going to give some of that money for housing providers to say, hey, listen, if you actually keep your housing in good condition, you won't have to pay all these inspection fees and fines. And we're going to give some of that money to the agency to go in and actually fix those problems themselves. And I think, those kind of ideas are what comes out of strong oversight. And when we hear the same things over and over and over again from residents, because we're listening and it matters, and we all have slightly different ideas on how to get there, but the number of bills that are before in Randy's office now on this topic demonstrates that we really care. And hopefully we'll be able to get them through the process.
Thank you. Any more?
Yeah. One more thing. There is currently a bill in the Committee of the Whole to actually break up DCRA into 2 agencies. I think we've had enough oversight hearings where we've heard enough horrible interactions between tenants and landlords, and how poorly DCRA has handled those situations. My boss, and probably has heard from a lot of his colleagues as well, that something drastic needs to be done. So currently the bill is called the Department of Buildings Establishment Act. What this bill basically does, it will divide the DCRA agency into 2 agencies. One would be the Department of Licensing and Consumer Protection, basically everything to do with regulatory, business licenses, all that other stuff that we actually don't hear too many complaints on. And then the second department would be the Department of Buildings. This would have everything for housing code enforcement, illegal construction. It would also do with property maintenance code violations. The chairman and a lot of folks on the council really believe that there needs to be an individual department with a single mission to really focus on the housing code issues that current district residents are facing.
Samir, did you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on what I talked about, emergency legislation, and an example of how that works in council that has worked in the last year. So earlier this year, the U.S. Marshals changed their eviction policy such that they would no longer instruct landlords to remove evicted tenants' properties outside of the place that they are renting, or they were renting. The unintended consequence of that was that there was some uncertainty created about how evicted tenants would get their property and where it would go. The chairman introduced legislation that allows evicted tenants 8 hours within 7 days of the eviction to remove their property. And so we're very appreciative that the chairman was active in making sure that we had an emergency legislation and something in place for when this policy went into place. However, Councilmember Nadeau was one of 2 council members who opposed this legislation. But at the same time, we are working on permanent legislation, and the chairman and the chairperson of the Housing Committee, Councilmember Anita Bonds, has been very active in making sure that we have robust engagement with stakeholders, and we want to make sure that we get the right policy in place. So that's kind of an example of how emergency legislation, or when emergency legislation is necessary, and how the permanent legislative process works coinciding with the emergency process.
Thank you. Well, that's been really informative. Thank you, guys. I know I've learned a lot, and I see a lot of hands go up, which show a good sign. I'd like to open up for Q&A, and we will start with the gentleman over there with a hat. He had his hand up for a while.
Yes, my name is Campbell Johnson, and I appreciate the presentation, although I think most of it can be or has been covered in brochures that are passed out about government or in 10th grade civics courses. The thing that I have a concern about is the first thing would be the fact that in terms of my house, I've had a notice of infraction last year or year before last about the grass being too long. And on the back of the notice of infraction it says, cut the grass, come down, and you don't have to get it inspected again. Okay, did that. This year, I get the same sort of notice. I could take it down, take the photos down there, and they say, oh no, we can't accept it. DCRA cannot accept them. You have to go and date the photos now. But that's not on the notice of infraction in terms of abating the problem. Okay, get a vacant building sign up on the front of my house. And they asked for a utility bills for a month. Okay, so I take the utility bills, attach them to a letter, go down to DCRA. Person would not take them, would not accept them, and said, oh, you got to give this another month, the preceding month. That's nowhere in the code. You know, you don't change these hoops arbitrarily, and you don't accept the documents. What the heck is going on here? I'm talking about some sort of enforcement that's needed, and it's not just divvying up more paperwork. Somebody got an answer on that? Oh, what I intend to do is to send my subsequent correspondence to your boss, Phil Mendelson. I intend to also send it to McDuffie and also to Attorney General Racine, and maybe he can sue the DCRA because they are not serving the people.
Thank you for that question.
Do you have a response on that?
Well, because of the interest of time, I'm going to take a bunch of questions.
We didn't start till 15 minutes late.
Señor, nosotros empezamos sino 15 minutos más tarde.
Why don't you answer this question? We've been late all morning.
¿Por qué no responden la pregunta?
We want to hear the answer to his question.
They wanted to hear the answer.
Yeah, I'd like to have the answer to his question. We've been late all morning. We didn't start.
We're just going to take 3 questions.
I can hold mine until I hear his answer.
Quiero esperar
The Affordable Housing Trust Fund. My understanding is that developers are being allowed to consume trust fund money,
Other than affordable
but
housing.
the money is not necessarily going into affordable housing. And there's 10%. So if you have a building that is being why are developers being allowed to consume money that's supposed to be going for other purposes?
That was in the Washington Post Inspector General's report.
One other question in the back, and then
And then we'll dance. And then we'll dance.
the lady.
He's taking 3 questions.
No answers?
My name is Benita Rose. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I have a volunteer. I have case manager at the housing. I have case manager at the VA VASH program. My property has been abated, and there's no consistency in the chain of command. The housing comes out and inspect the same thing every year, the same problem. This year, the past 2 years, the owner is selling his property, so he's not fixing it. So it's in abatement. When it's in abatement, I don't get my LIHEAP or my anything to help me pay my utilities, which is not fair to me. The other thing is housing. I would think should when they abate it, it should notify DCRA or whatever agency that can sue them. Nobody gets to sue them. I'm sitting there smelling mold, leaking roof, and all of those things. And then I find out that there's an agency that the housing inspector, a different department, can come out and do an inspection, and I can go forward with that. But in the meantime, it's because of the abatement, I'm not going to get any compensation for living in that condition. They say all we do is just take the money back don't pay the landlord, but you got to live like this, and we're not going to go any further, so you can get anything to move out. And then you got the TOPR. I can't get the TOPR now because you changed the rules, but I was already there. I'm a senior. I qualified under law 22120, but now you're saying that all I get is to live there for another year in the same conditions and nothing ever happens.
So I want to address the gentleman's first question. He's talking about DCRA. So unfortunately, your case is not uncommon, which is one of the hugest problems that the council member, a lot of the council members and the chairman have with DCRA. Their unresponsiveness, their lack of enforcement, particularly when it comes to folks like yourself who are trying to be compliant, right? So you go down to the agency, you bring in the paperwork that they've requested, and then you're given a different answer depending on who you're speaking to, right? Right, you jump through another hoop. And what ends up happening is, so you say you're going to reach out to council member, you're going to reach out to the chairman, which is great. Please do. I wish I would have brought cards with me, but I'll give you my email address and I'll make sure to follow up with you. But one of the things that happens, which is ridiculous, is that you reach out to a council member's office, and we in turn turn around and ask the agency, what's going on with, Mr. What's your name?
Johnson.
Mr. Johnson's property. He's been having issues with you being responsive or giving him consistent standard information. What can you tell us about his case?
And poor professional practice.
Absolutely.
You should be able to receive a document, date stamp it so that I can have my copy of that same document.
I agree. So when I talk to you after this panel, I'll go ahead and I'll give you my contact information.
Okay.
We'll have to follow up with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I'd like to point out that all the telephone numbers and contact information for all the council members is in this brochure.
Yeah, I'll make sure.
We're going to take one other question, and then I've been told
It
to
doesn't do
wrap
any
up.
good to call those people down there. What the council member, if they're over top of it, get rid of them. Put them out for a minute and let them be out there without a job. In our apartment, we got to do the same kind of paperwork. They got that same paperwork, and we haven't gone nowhere. They know what our status are. We got to go down there. We got to take bank statements. We got to go back. Oh, I got to bring in 6 bank statements. What is I got to bring in 6 bank statements? I ain't no millionaire. You get a once a month check, and that's what I get. And they see it and they know it, and they keep us running through the loop. So if y'all are the ones working with the council people, and y'all seem to be the ones that's out on the foot, because the council people ain't where we need them to be, maybe y'all should come and let those landlords know, DCRA, all of them that's not doing their job, maybe they need to step down. Because if y'all is out on your foot doing the work that the council people should be doing, and when we go down there to see them, they're always busy. I don't have but a few minutes, or they sending their personal out to say, I don't have time to talk. Stop sweeping us under the rug, because the more y'all sweep us under the rug, DCRA, all of them is going to do the same thing. Go get your local contractors that will concern and get them come out and do the work, and you pay them, because your government people is not doing the work. We got people that we know that can do the work. Y'all say you want to find out about where this money can go? All those empty buildings you got, let those tenants that's in there, help them to buy them and do them and put them in there for low income. Because there's a difference between low income. You see what I'm saying? Because y'all they really don't want to know where the money can go. Because if they did, they would have had us down there and we could have tell them where the money can go. Then those cheap landlords or deadbeat landlords would stop stealing from us. We shouldn't have to jump through hoops. We live there. We've been there some 50 and 40 years. You already know our income. And why is we got to go for reinstatement every, once a year or 2 years or whatever? But we have to get our rent go up every time. And we can barely stay there. And we got conditions in those apartments that a dog wouldn't live in. So we need y'all to come out maybe and shake up your bosses and take some pictures and come in the houses where we live and take some pictures and take back. Then if that don't move them, then maybe y'all should run for the seat and kick your bosses out.
Just make one comment. In the interest of time, I want to make one comment. There's a solution to problems that isn't being looked at. The head of DC General Hospital was incompetent. So what do? They shut down DC General Hospital. That is inane management, okay? That is inane. Then with DCRA, you have incompetence there. So what do? You divide it up and create more bureaucracy.
If you
have any other questions, and pardon me for interrupting, because we want to hear your concerns, but we're out of time for this session, so you can stay after, and maybe they can stay after.
Yeah, stay after. We should stay till 4:30 at least.
I would like to wrap up now for being so patient. So we do have a raffle.
Everyone has a ticket. Does everyone have a raffle ticket?
I'll take the Ferrari.
We got a nice party gift. Only one winner. Okay, so you're going to shake it up and pull it out.
I'll take the Ferrari.
And the winner is...
Number 723. 608 723.
723. There we go. We got a lucky winner.
All right.
All right. You're going to like this gift.
Thank you so much.
Sure. I should have more time for Q&A.
But you know what talking about policy.
So this is going to be
policy changes.
So do you have a reinforcement down here?
Are you familiar with the lawsuit? It's against the city in excess of $1 billion by systemic discrimination for the city. They have seized upon a theory by a professor at Toronto University. His name is Richard Porter. And his theory is you cater to what's called the creative class. And he defines the creative class and you ignore everybody else.
Yeah.
And the people that the creative class is made up of.
And I guess
Creative class is defined as tech specialists, artists, but not struggling artists like Halcyon Studio. Those that are able to take their services. Entrepreneurs and purveyors of creative innovation.
Hi, my name is Joyce Robinson Paul. My name is Joyce Robinson Paul, and I want to make sure that people understand that there is a vicious attack on senior citizens in this city. We are being attacked in every way. We are being attacked through property tax. We're being attacked through DC government agencies not doing right by us. We are being put out of the District of Columbia in many ways. We would ask our citizens to stop complaining And when you go to the polls, vote these people out. That's from Mendelssohn all the way down to the last commissioner or council person there is. Vote them out. Now, of course, if you do the same thing, which is vote them back in, you deserve the same results. Have a great day.